Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So we were talking about Mendelian genetics. Okay, so and we were talking about how all genes work, etc. And we said, who figured it all out? And here it is, Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk. His Austrian Empire. It was a very big thing at one point. And this is in the 19th century. He lived from 1822 to 84. And he's known as the father of genetics. So, and he was a monk, and that's reasonably apt. And Gregor Mendel is quite an ingenious individual who did very beautiful and simple, elegant experiments to figure this out. So he was a gardener. He loved to garden. That helps. Scientist, teacher, mathematician. So all around pretty smart cookie. So here he is. That's from Austria. Around the time of Napoleonic Europe and thereafter. So this is Gregor Mendel. He's a postage stamp. Anybody who makes it on a postage stamp is pretty important, I presume. Okay, now what he did is, as we said, he loved to work with in the garden, right? So he grew these pea plants, you know, the green peas. The green pea plant looks like this. It's actually quite a beautiful looking plant in my mind. And it has peas over here, and it has different types of flowers. Okay, it has a purple flower and these white flowers. Okay, and these are the plants. They're easy to grow, and they're easy to work with and easy to experiment with. So, and then they produce a lot of results really fast, right? Because you can count these peas, and it's very easy to count, and etc. So they're very convenient to do such genetic experiments. So he worked with the pea plants. So here's an example of a couple of types of pea plants that he worked with. As you can see, some of the differences are obvious, and the purple flowers versus white flowers, and the color of the pea pod, I guess that would be, and that he worked with. Now, what he would do is actually he would cross-pollinate these two different types of pea plants. Okay, so he would take his paintbrush, I guess that was one of his other talents, and then he would take the pollen from one flower and pollinate other flowers. He would be a pretty busy bee. Okay, so he would cross-pollinate flowers in that way. So, and then he would observe what would happen if he cross-pollinated these types. Okay, and then you notice that if you take a plant that has like round peas, and if you cross-pollinate with, you know, a plant that made like this wrinkly, you've seen those wrinkly peas? You've noticed ever? And didn't pay attention to them peas, did you? Now, pay attention to your P's and Q's for now. Okay, now look. So you look at the peas. You notice that they're not like because they're, you know, dried up or anything. There are peas that are like nice and circular, you know, round, and the wrinkly peas. They're two genetically different types of peas. So he wondered what would happen if you just cross-pollinate these, okay? And then that's how these experiments started, and he would take paintbrushes and pollinate in this way. So what he noticed is something quite interesting, okay? He would take, I like those are cute. Now look, he would take plants that had like green peas, okay? Okay, they made green peas. And then he would cross them with the plant that had yellow peas, okay? And then he would notice that every single baby plant he would have, the generation, the plant, they would all be yellow. It's like what happened to the green peas, right? He didn't know how to explain that until he, you know, did experiments to figure it out. And then he said, well, I wonder what would happen if you cross these plants. So the first thing he did was he took these green parents, the one parent that made green peas, and he crossed them with the yellow pea plants, and then he noticed that, so this is called the parental generation, see, parents generation. That's called the parental generation, and this is the first generation, F1 generation. This is called the first filial family. He called them first filial generation. Okay, he took the parental generation, crossed them, and he noticed that, to his surprise, among all of them peas, there was not a single green pea. It's like something happened. It seemed like the yellow pea dominated or something like that. So, and then, what curiously, he didn't stop there. He said, I wonder what would happen if I, you know, pollinate this flower with itself. And so that's what he did. He cross-pollinated the F1 generation, and then he noticed in this second generation, F2 generation, this is the second filial generation, he noticed the green peas came back. And you must understand, this is a garden you're talking about. We're talking about hundreds of peas plants, and he's checking things out. And in the first filial generation, there was not a single green peas. And in the second generation, and it constantly, the ratio would be 3 to 1, like 1 to 3, and it would be like such an easy experiment to reproduce, and it would always be amazingly same. 25% of the plants would be green peas, and 75% of the plants would be yellow peas. Now he goes, I don't know about you, but first of all, it's a pretty cunning experiment, and second of all, if I was him, I said, what the heck, what's going on over here? You have to try to explain why this happened. How come the green peas disappeared in that first generation, right? It's a pretty intriguing thing to do, right? Sometimes I say, yes, I figured it out, but here it is. So how did he do this? And okay, so first we're going to understand what he did, and then and second we're going to understand how he explained all of this. Okay. To understand this, you have to understand what's going on with the flower. See, the flower in plants, is the sex organ of the plant. That's where the sperm and the eggs are, so to speak. So flowers are they have both the male and the female component. Okay, and so flowers have both a male and female parts to them. Okay, the male parts of the flower are the pollen producing stuff. Okay, that's all together, that stamen with the pollen. So all together they're called the stamen. Okay, so and the stamen has two components: the anther, that's like this little antenna anther, and this is the filament. It looks like a filament right here. Okay, so the male parts of the flower are the stamen, and which has the antenna like anther, and the filament, which is filament like a thread. So anther and filament. So anther and filament together give the stamen, and the pollens are stored over here. And when the anther is ripe, it breaks open, and the pollens all are released and cause a lot of allergies to some people. Now, the female parts are over here, labeled over here, and they constitute the pistil. So the female, this is the whole thing over here. Okay, that's the pistil. Okay. And the pistil has several parts. The first, very top part, that's called the stigma, and this tall column over here, that's called the style, and that over here is actually called the ovary, and that's the ovule. That's the insides of the ovary. This whole thing is the ovary. This whole thing is the ovule. I'm sorry, and that's inside the ovule is the ovary, and that's where the eggs are. So each one of these little tiny things is an egg, and the pollen is like the plant equivalent of the sperm, and the pollen are going to fertilize the egg. So you have to first understand this. Now, when we study this in detail in the future, you will see quite remarkable how this whole phenomenon is very similar to what happens in humans. Plants have male and female parts. Plants, in fact, have genders, right? Sometimes. So some plants are gendered. In other words, there's a male, for the ginkgo tree, for example, right? They have separate trees for males, separate trees for women. It is for females. But most plants, flowering plants, they have both male and female parts in the flower. Okay, so this is just the basic anatomy of a flower, and the stamen is the male components of the flower, and the pistil is the female components of the flower, which consists of the stigma, style, and the ovary. Okay, now how I view the same thing as I have already expressed. If you look at the stamen over here, inside the anther are all the sporangia, or the pollen, microsporangia. That's just a fancy name for pollen. So, and as this anther matures, see, in the springtime, it gets harder, and then it breaks open and releases all the pollen or sporangia. And then what happens is they pollinate. They go over here, and the pollen lands over here, sometimes with the assistance of bees, and the pollen actually digs its way, literally. It digs its way and finds the egg, and they fertilize the egg to give a zygote. So and then this develops into a new plant. Okay, so this is the anther, and this is again the female part of the anatomy of flower. So most of the time fertilization occurs. Here's a pollen coming over there, and those pollens are actually, they literally dig their roots down and then they fertilize the egg. So that fertilized egg then develops into a seed which is capable of producing a new plant. Okay, so the giant oak tree starts out with a small seed, and that's it too had to be fertilized. So gametes, okay, and there's male and there's female gametes, right? And that when they combine together, they're no longer called gametes. They're called zygote. Okay. All right. So zygote is a fertilized egg. So the male gametes, okay, and the female gametes. So in the case of humans, like sperm and eggs, when they combine, they give a zygote. So a zygote is a fertilized egg. So this is terminology that you have to understand. So gametes are the male and female sex cells, and zygotes are the fertilized egg. And so when the egg here is fertilized by the pollen of the plant sperm, it produces a zygote, and that zygote becomes the seed, so to speak, and which we shall study and show in the future in detail, and that seed can develop into a new plant. And this applies to flowering plants, as you see here. Now, plants can self-pollinate, and the pollen can go from its own anther to its own pistil right here, or they can cross-pollinate, and this is what bees do. Cross-pollination, of course, will increase genetic variability, right? So it has its important value, and it's in climates that are not windy, cross-pollination has become very important, right? So self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now, our pea plants, what Gregor Mendel, predominantly reproduce by self-pollination, okay? And once that egg is fertilized, okay, fertilization, that produces a zygote, and in plants, you'll see it develops into an embryo, and that's like this fruit. So fruit is basically the embryo of the plant with the seed, and the seed, if it's dropped in the ground, will develop into a new plant. And this new plant will develop its own flowers, and the cycle then will recur. Now, Mendel would assist this, okay? So what Mendel would do, it's kind of crude in a way, but what he would do is he would take a purple flower, okay? He would snip off, okay? He would snip off the male part of it, okay? It's called emasculation. He would snip off the anthers, and then this plant will only have the female part, right? So nothing will be able to pollinate this purple flower unless he took a paintbrush from a yellow flower or something and put those pollen over here. So the way he would do his experiments is that he would take whatever he was working on flower, the plant, to take the flower of that plant, and he would remove the male part, because the male part, it doesn't develop into the embryo. It is the female part, once this egg is fertilized, that develops into the plant, right? So he would take the anthers out, and he would pollinate. He would manually pollinate, as you can see over here. He would collect all the pollen and pollinate the plants. They say it's not like he's going back and forth. He'd collect all the pollen here, and he would pollinate upon it. So that's how one accomplishes experiments pollinating, where Gregor Mendel functions as the bee. So he would transfer the pollen with the assistance of a paintbrush. Okay. So with the purple flowers in here and the yellow flowers, when he did this, he noticed that the next generation, the hybrid, were all purple flowers. In this case, you and I now know that the purple flower gene must be dominant, and that's why this is, okay? So, but what happened to the white flowers? They all disappeared. Not forever, right? So this is, again, what he did in his experiment. He would take a flower, and he would just cut these off, right? Okay? So then you would have something like that. That's the emasculated flower, right? Okay? And then he would take a flower of different type, and he would pollinate the flower using the genes that he was particularly interested in studying. So I'd like to introduce his initial experiment, and we shall elaborate on this next time, but here's an introduction, okay? So he took plants that produced yellow seeds, And then he took plants that produced green peas, yellow peas and green peas, right? And then he noticed, of course, as you recall, that all the seeds in the first generation, the F1, the first filial generation, pay attention. You're not falling asleep, are you? Okay, now, all right. So pay attention. So all the peas in the first generation were yellow, okay? And then he pollinated them, and then he noticed the green peas came back, okay? And consistently the ratio was 3-to-1, okay? So how did he explain this? Okay? So again, this is the parental generation, and everybody in the first filial generation, the first generation, F1 generation, was yellow. And when they were self-fertilized, they give yellow to green in a ratio of 3-to-1. This is the second filial generation. This is what happened. They had a lot of pea soup, I'm going to say. So here's how they explained it. And he figured it all out. And he said, okay, this is what must happen. There must be a gene for yellow. There must be a gene for green. Okay, and since the gene for green disappeared, he called them the recessive gene. Okay, the yellow is the dominant. There must be two genes. He figured it out. Okay, but one gene would not be sufficient to produce that 3-to-1 ratio. So he said both of them must have two genes, and this must have two yellow genes like YY and two green genes, and he labeled them little y, right? Because they're recessive. And then he said if you cross-pollinate them, every single plant will have big Y, little y, because all the gametes produced by this plant will be Y, and all the gametes produced by this plant will be little y. And every single plant will be big Y, little y, and he figured this gene must be dominant, the recessive gene is not expressed, and that's the reason why all the plants were yellow peas. But then he said, if you cross-fertilize them, you get 3-to-1 ratio. How's that? Because then he realized that this plant, if you cross this plant, is going to be able to produce two different types of gametes. Okay? So self-fertilization will result in this gamete and this gamete. And then if you have another flower, that gamete and that gamete. And here, okay, there are 4 distinct possibilities of combination of those gametes. Big Y, okay, big Y, little y, and big Y, little y, and little y, little y. This is called a Punnett square. And if you notice in the Punnett square, okay, let me suggest to you this is called Punnett square, and we'll talk about that in detail in the future. Typically, if there are two heterozygous genes, the dominant gene is written first, like over here. Dominant gene is written first, and the recessive gene is written second. Typically, the male genes are expressed over there, and the female genes are expressed on this side. Okay, and that obviously it matters less when you're talking about plants, but just for consistency's sake, that's how they have done it. Now, so that's how. Then there are 4 possibilities, and then you observe that this will be a yellow plant because it's dominant gene. This will be a yellow plant because that's a yellow pea plant. This would be a yellow pea plant even though it's heterozygous because that's recessive. And this will be only green plant. So it will be 3 yellow and 1 green as a ratio because of pure mathematical probability, and that's the beauty of it. It is a pure mathematical probability that you get that predicts the outcome of these experiments. Okay, so the genotype is different for these. This is a homozygous dominant, and these are heterozygous, but the phenotype, how the appearance is the same. Okay, and that's the beauty of his experiment, and that's what he figured out. And it's such a beautiful, elegant explanation to the phenomenon, and that's what I find particularly fascinating. And if you recall, the genotype is the exact genetic makeup of the genome, and the phenotype is the overt expression of those genes. And in this case, for example, a heterozygous plant with a big P here representing a purple flower will be purple. And homozygous dominant will also be purple, and only the recessive genes genotype will be white. And this is Mendel's great contribution to to the advancement of genetics. Inshallah, next time we shall elaborate on this exciting topic. Until then, as-salatu was-salamu ala rasulillah rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum.